Hi there, my name is Martin Cordoba, and today I'm going to take you through my auto-ethnography screencast. So the question is, how has your schooling and/or university education played an active role in constructing and reconstructing your views about race, cultural and ethnic difference, and Indigenous peoples? Remember to draw on your experiences of the intended, hidden, and null curriculum. So the theoretical tools which I'll today be utilising to analyse my past experiences with schooling and education include post-colonialism, hegemony, normalisation of culture, cultural capital, social capital, and meritocracy. So I'm commonly known as Marty or Martin if you're a Spanish speaker. My parents migrated from Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1986, and I was born in Sydney, Australia, and grew up in the lower Blue Mountains, spending much of my younger years in the area and the western suburbs of Sydney. I now live in inner city Sydney, and I feel a connection to both my life in Australia and my Argentinian background, which has gotten stronger as I have gotten older, including learning more about my heritage and to speak Spanish fluently. So these are just a few photos of me progressing from primary school through to high school through to university. So as a child, I attended two Catholic primary schools, Our Lady of the Nativity Lawson until year 2, and then at St Finbarr's Glenbrook until year 6. My entire high schooling was at St Paul's Grammar School, Penrith, a private Christian non-denominational school. And I then studied a Bachelor of Fine Arts, graduating with honours at the University of New South Wales Art and Design, followed by a Master of Art Curating at the University of Sydney before commencing study at ACU. So firstly, today I'm going to unpack my experiences with racism and post-colonialism. So when I was in primary school in about year 5 or 6, I had a friend whose name was Jose. Jose came from a Spanish-speaking background just as myself, as his dad was from Puerto Rico. And of all our friends and classmates, Jose and I were the only two children who had such backgrounds, but Jose had a darker complexion than I did, and for that reason I can remember him standing out more than what I did. For the most part, I think we were largely comfortable within our group of friends, who were mostly from white Australian or British backgrounds, which was reflective of the area that we grew up in. However, I have a distinct memory of Jose one day wearing his hat backwards, and a boy who was a bit of a bully stating, "Hey Jose, Aborigines don't wear their hats that way," accompanied with laughter from other students. Apart from not only being a racist and totally derogatory thing to say, it was also completely ignorant, as Jose's background was not Indigenous Australian at all, but the stereotype that was painted was that since he had a darker complexion, he was treated as if he was lesser than in relation to Aboriginal people, who according to this classmate of ours weren't worthy of being able to wear their school hats the way a white person would. I can imagine this made Jose feel quite bad on the inside, but he had a good character, and I remember that he deflected it with another comment and just carried on. So in high school, for many years, I was called Mexican by a lot of my friends and peers for being of a Spanish-speaking background. Whilst for the most part I shrugged this off as being part of the banter of my group of friends, when I look back, there were definitely times where inappropriate and incorrect assumptions were made of my family background or Spanish-speaking countries in general, along with a lack of geographical and cultural understanding as to the difference between a country in South America, such as Argentina, and a country in Central America, such as Mexico, which are really very different in a variety of ways. Part of this is largely down to our media's portrayal of Spanish-speaking countries and the stereotype of Mexico perpetuated by American culture, which is one of inferiority in comparison to the US. Both of these issues are linked to both hegemony and normalization of culture, in that my schooling experiences, while certainly not all negative, were somewhat based on an idea of whiteness being the norm to which all others are judged, and that if you're outside of this, you were to an extent othered. High school was certainly more open than primary school in this regard. As being a private school in the western suburbs of Sydney, the school attracted families of a more diverse mix of cultural backgrounds from different parts of Western Sydney, the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury region. The pervading cultural norm of a white Anglo-Saxon person was, however, still the standard to which all others were ultimately judged. In terms of the post-colonial effect on my educational experience, I don't recall learning much at all about Indigenous history or the effects of colonisation in primary school. My memory is undertaking dot painting, which is a tokenistic way of approaching Indigenous art and creativity, and perhaps some little acknowledgement of Indigenous Australians to go along with this. In high school, we learn about some issues including the stolen generations, the Mabo decision, which recognised Indigenous land rights and removed the idea of terra nullius, but ultimately white European explorer history was still taught as something of merit, without the full story of the mistreatment of Indigenous Australians. This was something that remained part of the null curriculum of teaching, with the mainstream curriculum being focused on the idea that some bad things happened in the past, but that this has been resolved, which is not the case. Whilst racism was something that would not generally be tolerated if heard by teachers from my recollection, there were still existent racist attitudes towards Indigenous Australians, and I do remember hearing words like abo used in a derogatory manner. So the challenge, therefore, that post-colonial theory presents to educators is the call for new ideas, pedagogical strategies, and social movements which construct a politics of difference, forging the struggle to achieve cultural democracy. Now, I was hoping to show a video today which explores Australian colonialism and explains this to Norwegian high school students in terms of the problematic issues. However, unfortunately, there's been some technical difficulties. I've tried to upload the video with the presentation several times and attempted some conversions, but unfortunately it has not worked. The video, however, is on YouTube, obviously. So if you go to YouTube and you type the Australian genocide explained to Norwegian high school kids, it could be a good point now to maybe go and have a look at it and then come back. Essentially what the video does is it discusses how Australia is viewed as the lucky country, or a country that's, obviously very fortunate, that has a lot of resources, and how, this is kind of the base layer of how Australia appears. But if you dive deeper, you can see that it's built on colonization, a very brutal process which has been very bad for Indigenous people, and obviously they've been very heavily mistreated. So it's a very interesting little video, one that I think is good for people from other parts of the world to watch as well. So I definitely do encourage to watch that if you have a moment. So in an article by Melanie Back titled Racism and Othering for South Sudanese Heritage Students in Australian Schools, Is Inclusion Possible?, she discusses the problematic nature of racial othering which occurs in the Australian schooling system, which reminded me of some of my previously discussed personal experiences. The concept of othering is discussed as a process through which particular groups of people are constructed as other. Racism and othering are seen as being closely intertwined, and mostly racism as a form and dimension of othering. Experiences of racism were found to be multiple and complex, ranging from students being identified as other and excluded or ridiculed on the basis of skin colour or visible difference. People of African heritage in Australia are therefore part of a complex and racialised history, as through the process of colonisation, Australia's Indigenous peoples have been positioned as black, object and inferior, as the construction of a national Australian identity is white Anglo-Celtic. Since colonisation, immigration to Australia has been shaped by the Immigration Restriction Act from 1901, more commonly referred to as the White Australia Policy, which was formally ended in 1973. The enduring legacy of this policy has resulted in the continued construction of a particular Australian identity in which belonging continues to be racialised. So this quote sums up the racialised experience of being in Australia quite well. So if you walk along any street in Australia as a black or African refugee of Australian Aboriginal, you would be noticed, gazed upon, defined and summed up from within certain white socio-economic constructions and judgments about who you are. These constructions rely upon a history and social context of racist and discriminatory assumptions built into Australian culture and society. So my experience at university in regards to this has been quite different. As at both the University of New South Wales and at the University of Sydney, in the sense of both cultural and Indigenous acknowledgement. In terms of Indigenous acknowledgement, these universities acknowledge the Indigenous country they're on, and they provide protocol and guidance with regards to the fact that welcome to country should only be performed by an Indigenous person from that country, whilst an acknowledgement of country can be undertaken by anyone who is not from that country. So since I studied at the UNSW Art and Design campus, I have memories of attending many art exhibitions on campus at both the Kudos and UNSW galleries, and when a major exhibition or prize was officially opened, it would always be followed by an acknowledgement of country as a sign of respect to the original Indigenous peoples of that country. So both universities also had support networks for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and at the University of Sydney this included culturally safe spaces, academic workshops, and ongoing or private or group tuition, and also admission pathways assistance and support to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So it's understandable that schools have resources which are more limited in terms of universities and are not set up in such a professional, mature manner when it comes to these protocols. From my experience, however, there seemed to be a distinct lack of acknowledgement and support network during my schooling years for Indigenous students. It was something which was simply not mentioned or discussed, and the only recollections I have of personal Indigenous engagement at school were two Indigenous girls from a remote community spending a few days at our school in the year below mine, and a friend of mine having a distant Indigenous family connection, but it was never spoken about in any great detail or length and went by almost unacknowledged. I also took a look into the most recent annual report of my high school, which I could find from 2018, and I found that the workforce composition for that year included data that showed the number of full-time and equivalent and actual employed staff sitting at 81.5 and 44.17 and 94 and 54, whilst the total number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff sit at 0. I do remember there being many teachers of different migrant backgrounds, but no Indigenous teachers, and it is a concerning statistic that this has not changed over the course of almost 10 years. Without any Indigenous staff or advisors, it's hard to imagine correct protocols being put in place for Indigenous acknowledgement and teaching to be possible. In addition to this, from looking at the statistics on the My School website, which is part of the Assessment and Reporting Authority for the Australian curriculum, I can see that my primary school, St Finbarrs, has only 2% Indigenous students and 8% of students which come from a language background other than English. My high school, on the other hand, has more diversity in terms of students coming from a language background other than English with 22%, which is still not very high, but with even less Indigenous students at 1% of total enrolments. St Finbarrs does, however, adhere to the Byalawa Co-Contribution Scheme, which is a program designed to help Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families afford a Catholic education if they are in financial difficulty as part of the Catholic Education Diocese of Parramatta. St Paul's Grammar School, on the other hand, adheres to the policies of the Anti-Discrimination Act 1997 and the Racial Discrimination Act 1975. In addition to this, if you have a look at the distribution of the socio-educational advantage, the majority of students at both schools come from a position of privilege, as they are in the top percentile, with St Finbarrs at 40% and St Paul's Grammar at 50%. So in terms of acceptance for other cultures, languages and ethnicities, my university experience has also been different to high school. I believe that part of this is down to the fact that when you attend an inner city university, it's not going to be like a school in a more regional area in terms of diversity, as you will get a far greater range of diversity in an inner city context, as you will have students travelling from across Australia and the world to study at these institutions. I cannot say that I ever recall someone behaving in a racist or discriminatory manner in all my university studies to date. However, I do think that this also has to do with the fact that studying in the field of the creative arts, most of the students are usually quite open-minded and accepting, as is the arts community at large, as racism is frowned upon in a community that promotes and advocates for diversity. So I have made friends with and interacted with a range of students, both from Australia and internationally, throughout my studies. This is something which is also further demonstrated in the University of New South Wales anti-racism policy, which is committed to the goal of freedom from racial discrimination, harassment and vilification in its work and learning environment, and to ensuring that individuals and groups are not disadvantaged because of their race, including colour, nationality, descent, or ethnic or ethno-religious or national origin. In addition to this, the University of Sydney is aligned with the Racism It Stops With Me campaign, inviting all Australians to accept responsibility for countering racism, including how to learn about racism, be a good ally, responding for racism and acting for change. So in high school, I don't believe that many students realise the level of social and cultural capital that they held. Most, including myself, just assumed that this was the school that our parents wanted us to go to and that was that. We didn't realise that it had everything to do with our parents' income, especially being middle to upper class, and that we're at a significant advantage because of this, especially in relation to lower SES schools with many students from lower socio-economic backgrounds, including those of migrant or Indigenous backgrounds, and that if there were students of a migrant or Indigenous background at the school, then that was already something which the more typical white Anglo-Saxon students had an edge over. The ethos pushed by the school was always one of meritocracy, which was that if you work hard, you get the best results and you will get into the best university. Whilst I think that it was true that working hard was important, particularly during the HSC, none of us realised that in addition to working hard, the conditions were set up for us to be able to achieve highly outside of just working hard in terms of our social, economic and cultural capital. So at university level, I think all of us had a similar level of social and cultural capital, but I definitely did realise an evolution over time. I can see how my vocabulary and even my Australian accent has slightly changed from studying at university, which is something that I didn't quite realise at the time, but that has changed with the education I have received and the people that I was surrounding myself with, which was significantly different in terms of the environment to my high school. Having a good vocabulary and strong cultural competence was something which was definitely praised upon at university and became more important as I entered higher level studies such as Masters, and has continued on into my new degree of a Master of Secondary Education at ACU. The main difference is that at university, intelligence and cultural awareness were far more important than in high school. I also noticed that as my degrees progressed, this was something that became increasingly more important in terms of writing and speaking, which contributed to assignment work and critical thinking. This cultural and social capital was, however, created by our prior background and education. There was, however, an equal level of respect that was given to people of all backgrounds, including international students. So in conclusion, overall, I believe that my schooling and university life have had a big impact on me in terms of my overall education and in the construction and reconstruction of my views about race, culture, ethnic difference, and Indigenous peoples. I have had both positive and negative experiences, which I have learned and taken much insight from, which have played a significant role in the person I have become today. Critically analysing and looking back on these experiences has reopened some experiences which I hadn't considered for a long time. My hope is that these experiences have helped me to become a kinder, more understanding, accepting and empathetic person when it comes to my views about race, culture, ethnic difference and Indigenous peoples, based on my own experiences with these issues, and having seen the effect that this can have on others in terms of mistreatment, othering, and being made to feel as if they are somehow inferior because of their differences. So thank you very much for listening. I'm just going to show my references now.